Hello, students. We're going to be taking a look at Chapter 6 in our main textbook on power and privilege today. Power and privilege is a very complicated topic, and it's very heavy. I know that we talked a little bit about power and privilege earlier in the semester when we looked at like the marginalized versus privileged client and marginalized privileged counselor, but this theme definitely goes across all of the chapters that we look at in the textbook. In addition, we should have a guest speaker actually towards the very end of the semester that's going to talk about power and privilege. And so I'm going to try and keep this video sort of at a minimum, because I know that this is a topic that we kind of incorporate into other areas and where we'll definitely get more into. I think some of the important things is that, you know, power and privilege does not come from a bubble. Like we're not just like individuals who are experiencing some level of power and privilege or lack thereof, but it relates to groups, social groups, and then kind of dynamics of environments and structures and things like that. And obviously we can note the examples where you know, this power and privilege is at play, where we sort of see the lacks of power and privilege as well. And so the main part of this chapter talks about three approaches that are described to analyze the power relations. And so the first we're going to talk about is the liberal humanist view of power. And then second, we're going to look at the structuralist analysis of power. And then finally, we're going to look at the newest form, which is the post-structuralist perspective. And it kind of incorporates some of the characteristics from the first two, but then challenges them in certain ways and kind of highlights some of the ways that they're incomplete and formulates sort of this new idea of it. And so, yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those and kind of how they sort of relate to our world, our counseling world. So the first is the liberal humanist view of power, and it focuses on individual citizens who are, in theory, at least born equally, and that differences come from the choices that we all make. And so we kind of all have this even playing ground, and then based on choices that we make through our life is what kind of change things. And so the idea is that human rights are God-given, and we begin life with all of the same rights. And that change occurs within individuals is initiated by drawing on personal power. So it's power within each individual that needs to be sort of tapped into. From this perspective, we might analyze power in cultural relations is itself rooted in a cultural worldview. And so how do we view, or how is the world viewing the cultures in which we are part of? And so this liberal humanism has really dominated our counseling field. As we've talked about, many of our theories and techniques really look at the individual who walks into our office and internal structures that we can work on changing, and is very focused on them, instead of kind of looking at the climates and environments around our clients and focusing on that stuff. So we do see some of the newer counseling theories kind of branching away from this, which in a way is kind of good, that we can, you know, take things from not just being in the individual, but outside of that. And so let me just kind of make sure there's nothing that I sort of missed out on. You know, and when it goes on to kind of talk about how this then views racism. So racism exists because some people are racist. So it puts it really into the individual perspective. But again, as we talked about, racism doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so individuals don't just you know, aren't born and just grow up and decide one day, like, I think I'm going to be racist. There's something outside of it. And so it sort of highlights the negatives or drawbacks of this point of view. There is a tendency towards essentialist thinking. It lies in the theory of personal power. It links power and personal qualities. And so freedom and autonomy of action are considered essential givens for individuals. And so we all have freedom and autonomy to make our own choices, and therefore whatever choices we make lead us to you know, succeed in getting power or not. And so it does not emphasize cultural belonging strongly, preferring to emphasize individuals' creation of their own life. Culture still has a place in this schema as a collective exercise in many individuals' acts of initiative, and small groups are thought as collectives made up of principally of individual actors. And so the groups that we come from don't necessarily have as much of an influence on us as we have an influence on those groups. So social structures and institutions are assumed to be products of the autonomous decisions of individuals. All of this emphasis on the individual is not culturally neutral, as we know. It originates in the Western view and is dominated in the Eurocentric kind of traditions. And so again, it just doesn't really fit with everyone and in our world. The emphasis on individuals as a source of power does not account for the role of institutions in constructing individuals' lives. It portrays people as autonomous beings who are primarily responsible for their plight and easily turn into personal blame. And, you know, as counselors, we're meant to be non-judgmental, and yet we then place the blame for individual stuff on them, which doesn't really align or fit. Culture is not just a matter of individual difference, but of group allegiance, and cultural patterns act on the consciousness of individuals in powerful ways. It is therefore not uncommon for people to feel helpless in the face of systemic forces that constrain them. And the dominance of liberal humanistic values has been so taken for granted in contemporary counseling practices that practitioners regard it as the natural prescription for addressing human misery. Yet this stance is inadvertently blamed people who are marginalized for their very marginalization, which we talked about before, right? It sets the person who's being marginalized up as being responsible for their own victimization, their own oppression, their own marginalization, which is not, again, what we want to be doing. In addition, another problem lies in how individuals in this liberal humanist view, the process of subjectification is at stake here. It has to be learned rather than absorbed. In contrast to this position, structural approaches reject outright the mainstream humanist assumptions that the individual is both the source of all human action and the most important unit of social analysis. And so we're talking about the structuralist view in a minute. The liberal humanist account of power relations is seriously limited to the extent that it cannot acknowledge systems influence, hence the appeal for a structural analysis of power is formed. And so the second one is the structural view of power. And so this constructs the individual as a product of their position within a social structure. And so again, how we are in relation with the things around us. It therefore becomes important to analyze the structures, the shape that determine us, and work out how to change them. And so power is a product of a deep-seated social force that produces structural sets of relations among groups of people. Individual power is a downstream effect rather than the cause of these interrelational groups. And so we form these groups because of the power that comes down, not because we are necessarily always choosing those groups. It is produced by a virtue of individual membership in a group and by their position in a social structure, not of their own making. And so we don't create this, it's kind of put upon us in a way. A structural analysis suggests that the conscious thoughts and intentions of individuals are not to be trusted as the primary sources of actions. So that kind of goes in opposition to the liberal humanist one that we were talking about. They're rather surface effects of a much deeper structural system, right? This all sounds familiar. This is what we've been talking about. So below the surface of any social phenomenon lies a deep structure that gives shape to what is visible. Kind of, we can think about this as the iceberg metaphor, right? So there's like so much happening beneath the surface that we're not able to see. And so models of social structures often argue that they are foundational for human experience and that many things people talk about, get upset about, are less important. These things are the superficial epiphenomena that shift and change, not through conscious persuasion, but through fundamental shifts in those underlying social structures. And so to have really a change at the top, we have to have changes that are happening within the structure of it. And so a structural analysis is often compelling because it sees things through immediate, confusing detail to a more solid, enduring forces that are at work. So we can really clearly identify what is happening and what is the source of it that needs to be changed. And so it enables us to make sense of very different events by reducing them to a single unifying explanation. This perspective on patriarchy and Eurocentric practices divides people into opposing camps, again, as we talked about, of the oppressed and the oppressors, right? So we're in one or the other. And so we have this belonging to a defined group rather than individual intention, right? Like the liberal humanist view. And so within a social system of organization, the structural economic base is the means of economic production, right? It determines all of these things. Just make sure there's nothing that I'm kind of missing. So the structural analysis and the liberal humanist analysis do share the understanding of power as a commodity. The difference is how that commodity is obtained. So how do we obtain the power that we may have? The liberals' view is it's within us, it's the choices that we make. The structural analysis looks at we're obtaining this power through these different systems and structures that are at play. And so since power is assumed to be accrued by those in structural positions of advantage, those who are the objects of operation of power must be powerless. And so from this position, there seems to be little that the people that aren't in power, the powerless, can do to change things. And so it kind of sets up this idea that, or this feeling that because it's these structural things that are working maybe in our favor or not in our favor, there's little that I as an individual can then do. So it brings into the conversation the topic of hegemony. And so a problem for structural analysis of power is how to account for the times when people appear to be acting or speaking against the interests of their own groups, their own identities. And so the definition of hegemony given here is spontaneous consent given by the great masses of the population to the general direction imposed on social life by the dominant fundamental group. This consent is historically caused by the prestige that the dominant group enjoys because of the position and function in the world of production. And so it's like those, marginalized or oppressed groups kind of want to take on key features of that privileged or powerful group so that they can kind of be a part of it. And they kind of are an apologist and make excuses for that. And so this moves towards an understanding of how power operates inside the heads of those who may be oppressed. And so from a structural analysis, the liberal humanist analysis of power itself serves a hegemonic function. And so the structural analysis feel like the liberal humanist analysis of power serves to kind of support this hegemonic focus, is that the reason that those other people are in power is that the people who are oppressed sort of co-sign on it. There is a trap in this analysis. It tends to end up with a self-appointed enlightened person knowing better about what someone else is saying and reinterpreting it for them. So like, I can't think for myself. Someone else has to sort of explain that to me. And so this is kind of where some of those terms we hear about, like white-splaining and mansplaining and things like that, come from, which is in and of itself an act of power. If, I feel like as the dominant, being in the dominant role, have to explain to this other person, let me tell you about yourself, right? That just doesn't seem to to add any more power to that person. They're continuing to hold on to the power as they're explaining this to the other person. And so when counselors practice from within the structural discourse, they run the risk of communicating profound disrespects to their clients. And so we should never put ourselves in the position of like, let me tell you about yourself, or no, 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 no. This is how people of your identity, you know, kind of function, right? And that's not something that we want to get into. This is the effect of suggesting that colonized people cannot know their own minds. Thus, a structural analysis ironically risks adopting a position of superiority and disrespecting those that they aim to support. Again, not what we want to be doing as counselors. It talks about the concepts of gender, race, and class and how this kind of works within this concept. So the structural analysis often shares with liberal humanist analysis the assumption that power is owned by those in structural positions of privilege. And so from the perspective of most structuralists, power is a commodity or property possessed by those at the top of the social hierarchy. And so we've already talked about race as a race, and I think we talked about class too, but we're going to talk about gender coming up as a social hierarchy. It's socially created, you know, and sets people in positions of power over others. But social justice requires us to identify who owns the power and when we respond to the social injustice. Power is a finite quantity distributed unevenly between those groups within that hierarchy. And this analysis of power views oppression as a structured hierarchy. And so discussions about empowerment tend to view power as a property which can be appropriated and redistributed amongst those groups if we work at it. It also tends to make social change seem very difficult to take place. It's suspicious of and sometimes cynical about changes that do not significantly overturn structural arrangements. And so if we can't completely overturn the system and just burn it down, then what are we really doing? And so it's calling for this complete overhaul that is really difficult to have happen in real life, right? Like sometimes we have to work at smaller structures and build up to things. With the same ultimate goal. And so the role of the helping professional within this should be one of educating the oppressed about the nature of the oppression and producing an anger that might motivate change. So not I'm going to tell you about yourself, but I'm going to tell you about the system to help motivate some change to happen and us to do some work together. And so Fay, 87, suggests that critical oppressive movements are opportunities to educate those suffering from unjust hierarchical structures, to help them to develop the necessary volition to produce a transformative experience. And so, again, not focusing on you as an individual and how you need to adapt to the system or deal with it or whatever, but how can you work on changing it? And what can we do to sort of fight that system that is not working for us or, you know, is only working for other people. And so the main difference between the structural discourse of power and the liberal humanist discourse is the ability to critique the simplistic assumption that individuals are free agents with equal ability to extricate themselves from unjust circumstances. And we know that that's not true. Those who have been marginalized and oppressed can't just do it themselves because they're fighting against these systems that have all of this power that is inequitable or unequal. So structuralists focus on the centrality of repressive social practices that contribute to oppression, marginalization, and powerlessness. So, I mean, we can look at different factors of how this has been, you know, how this can be looked at. So, for example, like male counselors who are challenged regarding their ignorance of historical and contemporary institutional patriarchy and the effects on practice, how are they going to then work with women? So we have to have a good understanding. So whether we are in the role, or I shouldn't say role, the identities that we hold maybe of the oppressor or the oppressed, again, kind of having these binary categories, we should have an awareness of the other in order to be able to counsel them, because we can't only come from our own perspective and working with others. so it uses the example of gender to kind of outline this, and that's what I'm sort of skipping through a little bit. So structuralism views relationships between different groups as a hierarchy of oppression, where the power relations are understood to be both monolithic and fixed. Binary distinctions or either or distinctions that limit possibility or possible interpretations of only those two options. And so again, it's you're either oppressed or you're the oppressor. There's no in between. In a way, the structural analysis renders counseling virtually redundant, which is probably why the liberal humanist view, not only being the original, but also continues to have a strong influence, is because the structural analysis perspective kind of creates this sense of redundancy within the counseling world. The exercise of power sometimes is not objectable, and the effort to influence others is not essentially bad. It's just impossible for relations between people not to also be power relations. And so again, looking back at that marginalized and privileged counselor client, diagram, how do we avoid the differences in power when we're working with a client who inevitably is going to have some different identities than we do? The question of which practices of power are acceptable and which are not is the ethical question, right? And so then we move into this third account, the post-structuralist account of power relations and how that impacts our work as counselors and kind of looks at these different power structures. So this has a lot, it draws heavily from the work of Michael Foucault, which we, Foucault, I don't know how you say his last name, but it's gonna focus on him a lot and talk about him a lot. And so it's this idea, the post-structuralist account, is that it's not enough to assume that power is basically about stopping people from doing things. He regarded it as curious that most analysis of power focus on the negative functions of power. And not necessarily as a value judgment, but how the power prevents people from pursuing opportunities in life, blocks them, silences them, and excludes them. So it takes this very negative focus on power. And just as an FYI, there's a little breakout box, 6.1 on privilege. Privilege refers to the unearned rights and advantages that accrue to a group of people as a result of their membership of that particular group. It is often the basis of social inequality. Privileges often go unnoticed by those who hold them and are often assumed to be deserved or acquired through personal striving. So we have counseling processes to help people get rid of internalized taboos, the influence even into adulthood of parents who say no, and the blocking of expression of traumatic experiences. And so Foucault describes this negative emphasis on power, not so much as wrong, but as insufficient. So it just doesn't do enough. So he talks about power as being a commodity and prefers to speak of power as something inherent in a relation and associated with a set of discourse practices rather than something held by an individual. It is less essentialist idea that can lead to noticing greater complexity and nuances in how power works. And so it's not as simple, I guess, as it has been described in the past. And it goes into a much more complex description of this. And so he didn't want to argue against the existence of oppression or repression, and he did not believe that this was the main way in which power works. He believed that power is primarily productive rather than just repressive. He points to the ways in which power works to get things done rather than just stops them from doing it. And so kind of looking not from a deficit model, but, what can we work to achieve and accomplish? And I don't want to go too much into this again because it is a lot of content and we will continue to talk about it. Again, he kind of really takes both of those liberal humanist and the structuralist perspectives into account. It also suggests that power relations are based on the use of discourse and how we use it, not just simply the discourse that is happening. And so discourse transmits and produces power, reinforces it, but also undermines it, exposes it, and renders it fragile and makes it possible to thwart it, which I think we're seeing a lot of in today's climate, right? Like the what's becoming more dominant discourse is, you know, the anti-racist rhetoric. And so it's not good enough just to not be racist, but we actually have to be anti-racist. And that kind of goes across all of the isms that we can think of, right? Like sexism and ageism and all of that. It's not enough to just be not that, but to actually be anti it and work against, you know, recognize our own biases and not work from them, but then also kind of recognize the structures that surround us that work in those ways. And so it's dependent on the context in which the discourse is used rather than essentially tied to a person or a group of people. And so again, the climate that we're in, you know, our socio-political climate right now, that's what's coming up. Okay, so want to really focus on how this is impacting counselors. It talks about the different types of power, the sovereign power and the disciplinary power that's been used. We think a lot about the sovereign power that is, you know, tends to be very violent. You know, we think about it as being used either in times past or, you know, long since gone, or in third world countries and things like that, but it is something that continues. And then we look at disciplinary power, which really has become the chief means in modern times to get people to be loyal, law-abiding citizens. And so kind of our structures of the legal system and stuff like that prevents us from doing things and keeps us in line. And so how can those laws be used to keep order, but also to control people and keep them in their place? And so it focuses on producing the individual in an acceptable mold through supervision, control, and correction. So there are systems that monitor us, control us, and you know, the correcting if we fall out of line. And this brings up the idea of the role of norms. And so our laws are based on norms that we have and the definition of what would be considered normal or abnormal. And so abnormal is not okay and therefore needs to be controlled and corrected. But what we've already talked about is that depending on the discourses that are happening and the time frame and the context, what is normal and abnormal really changes and has a fluidity to it. So how do we really keep those firm structures in place when they're based on things that are not firm by nature? It talks about this a lot with its relationship with sexuality. And how that has been at play of, you know, laws against practicing different sexualities and you know, simply identifying as who you are from an affectional or sexual orientation. It talks about power and knowledge. And so, you know, the close relationship between scientific knowledge and power in ways in which science also represents the interests of the dominant discourse of the day. So when we're using science as fact in some ways to set up these different things, that can create systems that then oppress and marginalize people. When we look at like the bell curve, right? Like, so like, where's the range of normal falling? And so we use that as like a scientific evidence that when you fall outside of the norm, it's not okay. But the science just doesn't work there. You know, it's not that he's anti-science or I'm anti-science, but we need to recognize the ways or the places in which science doesn't necessarily work, or the science that we've come to hold as truth doesn't always work. It also talks about the confessional society, which a lot of times we talk about, you know, as like, you know, social media and like Instagram world and stuff like that of, you know, like we need to, you know, share these things and how that really is from a Western worldview and, you know, its origins within the church of confessing things and stuff like that. And counseling really has an important role in this, obviously, because people come to us and they share things with us that maybe they don't share to other people. It's sort of a place where people go to confess their private worries or explore their souls. And it brings these private worlds under, a level of rationality. So is it rational or irrational to be thinking these things and to have these experiences? And so counselors seldom thought of themselves as governing people's lives, but a post-structural analysis of power invites them to consider this carefully. So what ways might I be governing someone's life by guiding them in a direction of normality that maybe is my view or the dominant discourse and not necessarily a necessity? It is renewed interest in the operation of power in the counseling relationship. Again, we're going to keep coming back to that because it means that counselors should consider whether or not they are being used to adjust people to fit to the social norms of the day. And so this really plays a big role when we think about like the DSM and the changes that have occurred in the DSM, where at one point homosexuality was a diagnosis in the DSM. And so we as counselors could work with clients on trying to change that and do reparative therapies, which have, consistently been found to be harmful and very damaging to individuals who've had to go through them. But that was the dominant discourse of the day. They were working with the DSM that they were given. And where we look at the DSM today, in what ways are we kind of forcing people to fit into these molds that they don't need to be fitting into? And so this goes on to the concept of dividing practices and what ways we actually have a role in dividing people within social spheres. Dividing lines are not essential structures. They are conceived of from structural analysis, but are products of cultural and discourse. And so they are not hard and fast truths. It talks a lot about education and the way that education divides people as well. And so school counselors need to think of every conversation with students as being about issues of power, because schools produce people's lives and identity categories that dramatically affect life expectations. And so it's very important in those roles to consider that. It talks about resistance and how this plays a part. It's easy to reach a mistaken conclusion when we start to understand power from a post-structuralist perspective. We can gain the impression that because modern power has developed these new capabilities and efficiencies by getting inside people's heads to produce docile citizens, it is therefore impossible to resist. But we can start to notice when they're happening around us and even in our own practices so that we don't perpetuate those same things. It can be tempting to give way to cynical and deterministic view of the world. And there's a danger in that. Cynicism needs to always be examined for its contribution to the operation of power. And an alternative is to adopt a position of optimism, not on the available evidence so much as an ethical stance. There's a flip side to modern power. It's very strong, or being very strong is actually also its weakness. And there are various ways in which people have considerable amounts of freedom to resist the operations of power, and how can we use them both as individuals and as counselors, and use them to help our clients. And so the key difference between sovereign power and modern disciplinary power is that it cites from which place the power is exercised and multiplied and diffused everywhere. Power is not so centralized in the modern world. It's dispersed into every crevice of life, into every relationship, every divided practice that are produced and reproduced on a daily basis. And it works to get people everywhere to participate as instruments of their own and others' oppression. And so opportunities for resistance then are multiplied exponentially because of that great platform that we might have where the power structure is kind of spread out. And so they exist all around us wherever disciplinary power operates. Modern power has a very fragile core. And so modern systems of power are never total in their efforts. They are never completely dominant. There are always places where people can find opposing practices of power. We need to get them to join together. There are always alternative knowledges that exist. It's not always the case, however, that resistance to practices of power are coherent or well strategized. And that's where it really becomes important to come together. And so this person who's expressing resistance instinctively recognizes themselves as an object of power, but can't quite determine how. In this case, the action of resistance may be more damaging for the person themselves than the relation of power, because they're unsure of how to navigate it. So good counseling may actually help students articulate more clearly the particular operations of power that they object to, and develop more targeted strategies of resistance that produce change in their relations with others in the school community. The key difference here between structuralist and post-structural analysis of power lies in the position of the individual person and their options for the exercise of personal freedom. And so, as I said before, the structuralist makes individuals feel like I can't make a difference, or I can't make change happen because I'm just sort of one person. The textbook goes on to talk about advantages for counselors in the analysis of power. So there's sort of this vision of professional practice as a counter practice based on recognition of how modern power produces people's lives, and on an appreciation of people's efforts to resist this power. The post-structural analysis of power also directs attention to the counseling relationship on the assumption that it will always be a power relation. And so as much as we try to minimize that and get on an equal level, continuing to recognize that a power exists. Many discursive practices around counseling relationships structure privilege for the counselor's voice. And the ethical question is how counselors can approach this exercise of power. So we have a level of power in the counseling room. How do we use it is the big ethical question that we need to consider as clinicians. An ethical counselor cannot remove the operation of power from the relationship and create some kind of ideal power-free zone by practicing in ways that are non-judgmental, client-centered, and dialogic. But the counselor can conceive of counseling conversation as an exchange of power relation and ensure that the flow of power is mutual rather than unidirectional. And so how do we do that? First, it helps us to see that power is not always operate in terms of structures. Therefore, changing the structures is not the only way to bring about change. We are much closer than we think to where social change can take place, and this position can give counseling a more critical role in social change than has ever been assumed before in our profession. Foucault's analysis allows counselors to understand modern power, which they can easily reproduce in conversations with their clients. And it also enables them to base practice on counter knowledges when they detect power in the production of oppression in their clients' lives. The post-structural analysis of power allows a more extensive vision to the operation of power. Counseling can produce personal and social change that can make substantiative difference in the analysis power more extensive. The emphasis of post-structural analysis on modern power is on practices that produce relationships of power. Foucault talks about regimen of practices as being more foundational than structural of institutions, and power is assumed to be in social practices. And so a focus on practices is inherently practical because we need to pay attention to them rather than just the structures or the individuals. It asks us to pay attention first to language practices rather than what specifically lies in the hearts of individuals. Another advantage is that it spotlights the practices of power in counseling itself. And so we don't use that, kind of confessional technologies of power. And also the language of counseling in and of itself. If we recognize the discourse usages of cultural pieces of the operation of power, then we can refuse to talk in this way and not use it when we're working with clients. Creative counselors can find ways to kind of meet the requirements that we have from, outside sources, licensing boards, managed care and insurances, while also still respecting our clients. We need to have an acute sensitivity to the work being done by power relations to construct people's lives and help us to hear what is critical to the experience of the individual people we're working with. Counselors should consciously direct their work to this place where they can potentially have the most critical impact. They can help people discover different ways of governing themselves and not just being governed by others. Also talks about the practice of political spirituality. If counseling is situated at this place, clients will seldom find counseling irrelevant or have a lack of motivation to actively engage in it. It also focuses our attention on its cultural nature, and it requires us to take more seriously the daily operations of power and cultural relations and gives us tools in which to do so. It enables us to see that power and privilege are seldom monolithic and that cultural relations are often complex and nuanced, and we can thus avoid the mistake of thinking that people are powerless or completely lacking in their freedoms. And so there is a nice discussion with some situations to think about at the end of the chapter, followed by the response to chapter 6 by an individual in psychology. And that sort of ends our chapter here, but definitely not our discussion on power and privilege. And so again, we're going to be coming back to this again and again, and I look forward to talking with you in our next course meeting.